does an issue lay bare the secret heart of America itself, to the values and the meanings and the purpose of our beloved nation. President Lyndon B. Johnson said this in a speech to Congress, urging them to join together for civil rights reform, and thus urging them to join together for the destiny of democracy in the United States of America. President Johnson was waging a war overseas in Vietnam and also waging a war domestically on poverty. But he said if we succeeded in those endeavors and failed for the battle for equality at home, then we, as members of this great nation, would have failed. Thankfully, though, we have made strides towards the great ideals and principles set forth by our founders. All men are created equal, and government by consent of the governed. However, due to the Supreme Court decision this past summer that stripped away Sections 4 and 5 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we are now left defenseless in the face of an assault on those great principles. As our most basic right, the right to vote, is being taxed state by state with restrictive voter ID laws that disproportionately disenfranchise minorities, women, young people, and the impoverished. Now today I'm going to talk to you about the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the punitive effects of the Supreme Court decision made this past summer. Then I will introduce the new voter ID laws being passed in this country, what they mean to you as the American people, and why they are being passed. And then finally I will lay out my solvency plan to fix this unfair assault. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed after a century of violent denial of the vote to African Americans in the South and Latinos in the Southwest. It is widely regarded as enabling the enfranchisement of millions of minority citizens through the preclearance policy of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which determined all of the counties in Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act that they must have federal government approval before changing voting laws. Now, the VRA has been reapproved 4 times, most recently in 2006. But despite its overwhelming popularity in government, Shelby County, Alabama sued that coverage was outdated and preclearance unduly burdensome. By a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court declared that Sections 4 and 5 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was unconstitutional, leaving full jurisdiction of voting laws to the states, without federal oversight to the counties who were once subject to preclearance. Since the Shelby County versus Holder decision, 34 states have passed some sort of voter ID law requiring government approval or requiring government IDs for voting. 32 policies are currently in place, and they are said to stop voter fraud, and 8 have been labeled extremely strict by the National Council of State Legislatures in 2014, and 2 more that are equally as strict are currently pending. So, what do these extremely strict laws entail? Well, voters who come to the polls without acceptable identification must vote on a provisional ballot, sign an affidavit, and then return a few days later with proper identification to have that vote count. Now, photo IDs are a popular idea amongst members on both sides of the aisle, but it is the cost of getting this ID, the elimination of early voting, and the elimination of same-day voting registration that serves to disenfranchise. Now, these laws, like I said before, were passed to eliminate voter fraud, and stricter voter ID laws may be necessary if voter fraud was very prevalent in this country, but quite frankly, voter fraud is nearly non-existent. According to studies done in 2006 by the Brennan Center for Justice and 2007 to 2012 by the New York Times, these laws only protect against people coming to the polls attempting to impersonate somebody else, and the likelihood of that happening to you is 1 in 15 million. So these laws are in effect trading away millions of votes to stop something that almost never happens and is clearly inconsequential to elections. So how do these laws disenfranchise? Well, they disenfranchise those who are impoverished. In a 2012 speech by Attorney General Eric Holder, he said that many will have to travel long distances to get these IDs, and many will struggle to pay for them, essentially serving as a poll tax. These laws affect the younger generation. In many of these states, including our very own Tennessee, college IDs are no longer proper forms of identification at the polls. these laws affect minorities. In a 2012 report done by North Carolina's Board of Elections, 22% of the voting population in North Carolina is African American, reflecting a very similar national demographic. And they make up 34% of registered voters who do not have a DMV-issued ID. In addition to that, the Department of Justice claims that minorities disproportionately use early voting and same-day voting registration. And finally, these laws affect women. According to a 2013 study done by the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, women who've had their names changed to where they no longer match their current ID will also have to vote on a provisional ballot, sign an affidavit, and then come back a few days later to have that vote count. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, in 2007, 1/3 of women in this country currently have IDs that do not match their current legal name. So, why would we want to enact these laws if, according to the Brennan Center, they disenfranchise 21 million eligible voters in this country? Well, the simple reason is politics. In 2012, when Barack Obama won re-election, two truths became clear. One, Democrats win high turnout elections, and two, Republicans win low turnout elections. Now, to change this, political prognosticators claimed that the GOP needed to soften their stances on social issues and immigration. But instead of coming to the middle on these issues, they're now passing laws that try to disenfranchise those groups who tend to vote Democratic. According to Nate Silver, an expert in data journalism from 538.com, he says that in 2012, these extremely strict voter ID laws could have reduced President Obama's chance of re-election by 1.2% per state, revealing very serious electoral consequences on account of these laws. So, how do we solve this issue? Well, if 34 states are truly hell-bent on enacting voter ID laws despite an estimated cost of from anywhere from $276 million to $828 million, well then, cost be damned. Using the federal government, we will enact a voter expansion project that eliminates this nearly non-existent voter fraud, while at the same time expands the vote. The federal government will print up these IDs, have them readily available at every post office around the country, and with your photo ready to get taken, you can get your ID there free of charge. Now, this will not be a requirement to vote. This will just be an acceptable alternative for those who are being disenfranchised by these laws. Now, too many of those who are advocates for these state laws wrap themselves in the flag and claim of their strict adherence to the Constitution or their belief in limited government spending. But these laws are neither constitutionally founded nor are they fiscally responsible. And if we cannot stop them at the state level, then we will improve them at the federal level. And in doing so, we will keep everyone's rights intact. If we can so often look back with reverence and try to emulate what our founders have done and what America stands for, then we cannot overlook the injustices that this country has executed in the process, and we cannot turn the clocks back with second-generation barriers to the ballot box, which is exactly what these state laws are. To quote President Johnson one more time, "There is no constitutional issue here. The command of the Constitution is plain. There is no moral issue here. It is wrong, deadly wrong, to deny any of your fellow American the right to vote in this country. There is no national rights versus states' rights. There is only the struggle for human rights." So, let us not end up on the wrong side of the history books like so many before us who've tried to reduce the franchise. Expand the vote, and in turn, stand for America. Thank you.